Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video, wherever you are in the world, finds you well and safe and happy and healthy during these times. I really mean that, so please continue to take good care of yourselves and your loved ones. And also, I would like to continue on with the question and answers with respect to the questions that you posed to me on a particular video that I posted a few days ago. And so now, by my count, this is Q&A part 6. So I am just continuing on with the questions that I received on a particular video, the link of which is in the description box below, asking you for questions. And I'm just going in order of receipt of those questions. And I'm at the comment section of that video right now. So the next question is from Marc Muschler, excuse me for my poor pronunciation, Mark. I hope you can forgive me. Anyway, Mark, you say, "Hi Daisuke, excellent idea for a video. Apologies, but I'm going to borrow one of the questions you've posed to your audience. Why do you love cinema? What first made you passionate about film?" Thank you so much and have a great day. Okay, so I have mentioned a little bit about the films that really inspired me to continue on with my film journey, and the films that I saw when I was young that were particularly quite influential in that regard. But I suppose a general proposition, why do I love cinema? Let me just say that in that question, I interpret the word love to mean something that is a broad concept of love that is almost akin to an almost admiration for all that it is doing for me, both in terms of engendering positive feelings and also engendering negative feelings, and even engendering neutral feelings within me, in my heart and in my mind. And so what do I mean by this? I think that cinema is a reflection or an expression of the human condition, the human emotional experience, the human lived-in experience. And therefore, if we understand the human condition itself to be a very complex, complicated set of machinery, or a set of emotional synapses, or a set of quite complex, intricate, layered, nuanced experiences of one's life, which of course vary from person to person to person all across the world, then I think we can appreciate and understand that therefore cinema, if it is a reflection and an expression of that kind of intricate, complicated, complex human lattice work of experience and emotion, then cinema itself, by definition, is also itself very complex, complicated, nuanced, and it is a reflection and an expression of something that is very dense and profound, potentially speaking anyway. So I think therefore that is one of the reasons why I really admire cinema, for what it opens for me in terms of viewing the experiences of others. And therefore it also becomes a kind of mode of communication, as in it helps to communicate the thoughts and expressions and feelings of other people that sometimes, maybe because of my own geographic location, because of my own life experience, because of my own limitations in intelligence and experience and exposure, etc., to many other forms and existences in the world, etc., then I think cinema becomes a kind of avenue for a mode of communication that allows me as a viewer to somehow engage with a particular topic or subject matter or concept or political idea or proposition or even propaganda, or an expression, or an emotion, or a feeling, or a poem, or poetry, etc., etc. That comes from another person from another part of the world, or something to that effect. So I think that makes cinema to me very wide in scope, and also quite mesmerizing to watch. Now, I should point out that loving cinema does not, for me, necessarily translate directly to loving every single film that I've ever seen. I think loving cinema can also encompass reacting negatively to a particular form or particular art or work, example of cinema. So in other words, one can love cinema as a general concept and still react negatively to a film, maybe react neutrally to a film, and also react positively to a film, and every shade of nuance in between those poles. So I think loving cinema also means reacting or engaging with something that maybe one might disagree with. Maybe we see something expressed in a film that we might react against because of our own human nature and our own experience. And so I think, therefore, it's always very important for me to keep in mind that just because I see a film and I love cinema doesn't automatically mean that I am very much in line 100% with all of the concepts and thoughts and hypotheses and propositions, etc., that are made in that particular film or through the medium of that particular film. In other words, the engagement of cinema is what I love, and how it engages with me and how I am thus able to engage with it is what I love and appreciate about cinema. And what are the end results of those specific engagements? Maybe I end up agreeing 50% with something, 100% with something. Maybe I agree 0% with something, or something like that. Maybe I have a positive reaction on an intuitive, emotional level. Maybe I have a neutral reaction, or maybe a negative reaction, say on an intellectual level or a logical level. I'm not sure, but it really depends on the film. But my point is that loving cinema means also hating films, or not agreeing with propositions or hypotheses posed in films, sometimes reacting neutrally to a way something is expressed, but also reacting positively and even extremely positively to similar sorts of expressions found in a particular work, considering, taking into consideration what one's own position is, whether it's one's human experience, one's life experience, one's ideals, beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, etc., etc. And so I think the phrase, why do you love cinema, is very, very broad, and it should be. And I know that, Mark, your question is made in a very broad sense, which I really appreciate. So that's, I think, in general, why I really, I think, take to cinema the way I do. I should say that there is a sense of how should I put it? Cinema is not infallible. Cinema is also filled with faults, right? And that's okay. It is okay for cinema to have faults, and whether those faults are on purpose or not on purpose, it is still okay, because as we say, right, if it's a reflection of the human condition and human experience, the human condition and the human experience, as nuanced and complex as it is also not without fault. It is not free of fault or mistake, whether those mistakes or faults are intentional or otherwise. And so I think it is very natural and reasonable, therefore, to have cinema itself filled with faults and imperfections and the like. And so I think that is something that I really, truly appreciate. Now, it is also, cinema is also a kind of reflection of human endeavor and human achievement, and it is the result of creation. And so if we think of this idea of creation as a result of some kind of synthesis of two or more ideas, or two or more concepts or beings or things, etc., etc., then this also becomes a very important thing. It's not just an expression. It's not just a mode of communication. It is those, of course, but it is also a result of creation, of human endeavor. And, I think that process alone is worthy of great respect. Now, whether that actual end result is really, really good or really, really not so good, it really depends on one's own subjective tastes, of course. And therein lies the whole concept of film criticism, one's own views on films, the exchange of ideas, film reviewers, etc., etc. And so I think that is all perfectly, perfectly legitimate. But if we're just taking a step back and looking at the whole process of cinema, and if we look at that broad process, the broad brushstrokes, and then we think of that, your question, in those broad brushstroke terms, why do you love cinema? I think my answer is how I tried to describe it in these past few minutes. So I hope that answers the question, but it's a great, great question. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's see. Next is the Cinematheque. And hello, my dear friend. Let's see. Do you have any particular thoughts on slow cinema? Examples you cite are Bellatar, Nuribilla Ceylan, and Love Diaz, etc. So I have great admiration for this particular, let's call it a subgenre or subcategory or subsection of cinema. And I wouldn't necessarily call myself someone who loves a piece of work because of its running time, per se. I mean, a film that has a certain running time can be a good film or a bad film, you know? It really depends on the contents. And so I take an approach such that I try to look at the contents of a work and try to evaluate it and judge it and respond to it and engage with it on those terms, whether it be a very short film or maybe a not so short film, etc. And that also is an expression of the pace of it as well. If something has a very, very, relatively speaking, slow pace, I take that to mean something that is presenting information, presenting ideas, presenting in images in a deliberate way, or at a certain timed pace, let's put it that way. And so it really depends on how that deliberation and how that delivery and presentation provide an overall effect upon me as a viewer. So it really depends, therefore, on what the contents of those things are and what it is that is trying to be transmitted through the medium of the cinema. So again, I don't necessarily see it as necessarily something that I will automatically love or automatically hate within that subgroup or subgenre. But if it's presented well, or if it's presented in a way that I find engaging, then oh yes, very much. I have quite a great admiration for that sort of thing. And I should say also that there is a sense, if you will, of a deliberate pacing and the deliberate nature of slowness or stillness or quiet or other aspects of that sort of thing. Maybe another way to put it is the ability or creating the room for the viewer to have a sort of meditative or transcendental experience with images and sound that are put together in a kind of deliberate pace, let's put it that way. And so I think that kind of meditative or transcendental moment, it really is, I admit, it's quite a difficult thing for me to achieve a lot of the time. But if the circumstances are correct or right for me, then it is possible. And so I think, therefore, a piece of cinema, if it can engender this kind of feeling, and if it tries to, and it succeeds, I think it can become a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I would say that while that kind of experience can be said to be, based on some people's views of it, while that kind of experience can be said to be at the heart of what can be described, or what is described by a lot of people as being quote-unquote slow cinema, and while I would not necessarily disagree with that kind of assessment, I would also perhaps go further in that that kind of transcendental or meditative moment or moments that are trying to be aimed at I think that kind of thing can be achieved through many forms of cinema, depending on the nature of the content and the way in which the images and sounds are put together by the filmmaker, etc., etc. So it's kind of a broad statement. I'm trying to be as general as possible. So, but I have, I mean, the filmmakers that you mentioned, for example, I have great admiration. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question, and I hope that my response was satisfactory to you. Anyway, next is our dear friend lucazacforever. So, hello, my dear friend. Let's see. So you ask, do you ever fear that one day in the future, everything we love about cinema, good movies, art house cinema, movie theaters, film festivals, home video, etc., could end and would remain only blockbuster streaming services, TV series that I love, but they are not cinema, etc., like the end of an era? This is a dark thought that sometimes comes to my mind. I know that you are a fan of Italian giallo horror movies. Have you ever seen The House with Laughing Windows and Cemetery Man? If so, what do you think about them? If no, I highly recommend them. So to answer your second question first, yes, I have seen them, and I'm a great admirer of giallo and Italian horror from that period. And yes, so I've seen those films. I haven't spoken that much about Italian horror, save for, let's say, a discussion of Argento and maybe a little bit about Mario Bava, but I should try to remedy that very soon. And then as to your first question, this is a pretty difficult one, and it really goes towards a lot of things, really, and it really has a lot of really fundamental implications, and also has something that I think we all can enter this in a different way, and we can. It's very possible to become very, very passionate about one's answer one way or another. And so I would say that it's a difficult question, and it really depends on the nature of commercial cinema, because commercial cinema is a significant component of the cinema that we know today. But at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that cinema is a vast, vast ocean. It is very, very vast. And so what is considered to be quote-unquote mainstream cinema in certain parts of the world might not necessarily be mainstream cinema in other parts of the world, or mainstream cinema in certain parts of the world might not necessarily translate to being the cinema that every single person on the planet is into, right? Because it is a very, very vast thing. And even, when we think of something like, let's say, the Criterion Collection, I'm a great admirer of the Criterion Collection, don't get me wrong, but I always have to remember that the Criterion Collection is a very, 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 very small reflection of the entirety of cinema, from the birth of cinema many, many years ago up to the present, and also in terms of the wide geographical range of cinema. There are some nations or some areas of the world whose cinema is not at all reflected, let's say, in the Criterion Collection. And that's not to say that the Criterion Collection is the most comprehensive collection of home media cinema on the planet, but it is certainly one of the most highly regarded. But even the Criterion Collection, I think people at the Criterion Collection would probably also acknowledge this, is that it's impossible to try to address every single aspect of cinema within one collection or label, because cinema is that vast and that wide in scope. It is a really vast, deep, deep ocean. And so it is almost impossible to, or I think it is impossible to really fully appreciate the entirety of what people around the world throughout time have expressed through cinema. And so what we might think as cinema in terms of mainstream, let's say Hollywood films, for example, may be for some people the epicenter of cinema, and I have nothing wrong with that. But I think to other people, that is far from being the epicenter of cinema, and I have nothing wrong with that as well. And I think yet for other people, there are even different measures in which how to define cinema, what is the epicenter of cinema for a particular person. Again, it's all subjective experience and where one lives, what one likes, what one doesn't like, etc., etc. And so I think this is, therefore, it is almost, we have to try to keep that in mind. And so even something that might seem to be very, let's say, dominating, and I mean that in a positive way or perhaps even a negative way. It's your choice how to interpret that, of course. But even a certain method or mode of cinema that might seem to be really dominating in terms of, let's say, financial success or marketplace or market share and distribution in terms of commercial theaters that we might be most familiar with in terms of our own personal experiences. We always have to remember that there are other ways in which cinema is being expressed in other parts of the world and throughout time. And so even if we have certain, let's say, blockbuster films or streaming services or other things that might be, let's say, might seem to us to be really part of the conversation, again, that really depends on where we find ourselves in the conversation of cinema and what it is we see in terms of our own trajectory and our own journeys, and then our own particular positions in our lives. Again, I have to bring up the example of Hollywood because I think that's the most immediate. I think for some people, Hollywood is cinema. And I'm not here to say that's a good way or that's a bad way because, again, I don't think that there is any one correct answer. It all depends on one's view of cinema because we also have to remember that when we love cinema, that doesn't mean that we necessarily automatically love every single genre of cinema. It doesn't necessarily mean that we love only this form of cinema, not necessarily this form of cinema. And also by extension, I can't say that anyone who just loves this kind of cinema is limited or this kind of. All I can say is I really like what I like, and I hope other people see it, and this is why I like what I like, and that sort of thing. But that's all I can do. But I can't impose anything further on anyone. All I can do is just say what it is that I like about something else and then try to move on from there. But if someone at the end of the day doesn't agree with me or doesn't want to, let's say, take my advice or anything like that, I have nothing against that particular person. And I understand also that, once again, cinema is a very wide thing, but it's also a very subjective experience. And so I think that's my really broad way of trying to establish certain parameters before answering the question. And then when you say that blockbusters or streaming services might sort of dominate, or that, I think that might be the suggestion. Again, this is also the way in which things are changing over time and that sort of thing, because another thing that we have to keep in mind is that we are dependent on labels and on distributors and on essentially third-party companies or parties that are outside of ourselves. In other words, I can't go to, cinema is not in any way a kind of natural resource in the world. It is something that is created by human endeavor, and it is something that is put out there into the market. And then there are stages in between the film and us, the consumers or the viewers, distributors, labels, Blu-ray companies, or streaming services, that sort of thing. So those components will always be there. Now, what of those intermediaries becomes more influential? It really depends on how the market shifts and what the consumer tastes are and what the demand is. And also we also understand that demand changes are also subtly affected by marketplace changes and certain movements in these intermediary companies, let's put it that way, and also by extension the filmmaker side of things as well. So this is all to say it's a pretty complicated lattice work of shifting market forces I don't think it's necessarily an issue of pure demand and pure supply side economics, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But my point is that it really depends on how the market will develop, taking into consideration all these different variables. And as the market develops, we can either, as individual consumers, go along with that and our demand will increase because we initially wanted that in the first place, or maybe our tastes will adapt to the changing marketplace. In other words, we weren't into streaming services before, but now that streaming services are becoming more and more prevalent, maybe our demand tastes will adapt to that changing marketplace. Or we might say, this is not something that I particularly am looking for, and I will take my time and my money elsewhere, and we will go to another market and that sort of thing. And that's the nature of the marketplace and the nature of cinema now, because it's for better or for worse, it's something that we have to rely on Blu-ray labels and cinemas and distributors to give us the product. And also we have to pay money in order to be able to receive the delivery of that product. And so there is a lot of interplay going on. And therefore, if we are dependent on that relationship, then for some of us, we have to go along with what the market is trying to push. Or if we find that we are not necessarily dependent on that, maybe we can take a step back and say, maybe this is not for me, and I can focus in on other things or other currently existing things, etc. And I don't have to worry about streaming services to provide me the biggest, latest thing that has been released by, let's say, for example, the Hollywood cinematic industry or something. So this is all a very long-winded and perhaps not well-organized way of me saying that it depends. It really depends on your take and your own needs as a consumer and as a film goer and a film lover, and what it is you are looking for in cinema. For me, for instance, I'm not so good with watching the most current things. As I said, for instance, they're the biggest movies around, the Marvel films, but I haven't been able to see all but a couple of them. And so, but I still feel that I can love cinema in my own way, and there are things that I know that I'm missing out on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have a positive take or a negative take on them. It's just that my current interests and the way I'm trying to engage as a consumer in the marketplace are a little bit in a different place, perhaps. So, but I think that's okay. Maybe my tastes will shift, or maybe I will adapt over time, great, or maybe my trajectory in this particular example that I cite will continue on as it is. I think that's okay too. But so also finally, I am also aware that cinema is also about availability and about being able to access. And so that's one of the difficult things, which is if the method of access is limited, then we have to really try to keep that in mind. And so we can always talk about cinema, but we have to be able to watch it, right? We have to have the method of access to be able to watch it. And if those method of access are limited to us, then we have to rely on the only modes of access that are available to us. And perhaps for some people that is streaming, because as I say, it is not the cheapest thing in the world to buy Blu-rays or to buy tickets to go to the movie theater or something like that. And so we also have to keep that in mind too, what our own needs are and what our own abilities are and our own limitations are as consumers. And so it's that. And it's also a very expensive thing too. This is not the cheapest way to pass the time, of course, because Blu-rays cost money, movie tickets cost money, and there are many versions of things that come out, etc. So it's a pretty, it can be potentially a very expensive thing too. So I think that also has a lot to do with it. But is this like an end of an era? I don't know if I'd go that far quite yet, because we always have to remember that we can always look back on something, and we always have our own experiences to rely upon. but I think it really depends on what we're looking for in terms of a changing marketplace, etc., and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's a little bit long-winded of an answer, but this is, I guess, something that I'm still trying to work out in my own mind, so I don't want to seem like my answer now is in any way meant to be a definitive answer on my part. But these are the sorts of concerns and considerations that I have when I'm thinking about a question like this. But it's a great question, so thank you very much for that, my dear friend. Thank you. Next, we have a question from our dear friend John Adair. And let's see, something I mentioned before to you, but your view on 4K and home cinema. Is there a point, and will the likes of Criterion and Eureka go down that line, or will all physical media stop and everything be downloaded? I'm sure I'm like everyone here and wants to buy and have their movies in their hands and shelves. Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So again, I'm not sure what the specific plans are for any labels to go the UHD 4K route in home media. And so it really depends. These are all, again, marketplace concerns and supply and demand, although as I tried to mention in the previous question, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But the point is that it really depends, right? And I really couldn't say. I mean, it is possible that someone like Criterion or some company like Criterion could go that route, but it's also possible that they could abandon such plans if they had them in the first place. And then ultimately, to answer the implicit part of your question, which is what is the nature of the physical media market going forward? I mean, it is very possible that that market could shut down or it could collapse in a few years or 5 years or something, or 10 years or something like that, or maybe less. Really depends. I can't quite gauge it. So, and do I like that news? Of course not. I'm a big physical media fan, as you know. I have nothing inherently against streaming services, but just for me and my own personal way of consuming product, for whatever reason, I have a certain comfort with a disc or a VHS tape or Laserdisc or whatever it may be, because that's how I grew up, and those are the preferences that I developed over time and throughout my life. And so, so again, it really depends on the marketplace. And I could say that Blu-ray is healthy, and it seems like it's healthy now, but it's really, or when I say Blu-ray, I should just step back and say physical media. I think physical media is not in an unhealthy situation. But we also have to keep in mind, too, that economic conditions can change. We have to consider, for example, the current world crisis that we are in. And we have to remember that this current world crisis also will have effects that will be lasting for a long time to come. And this is very unfortunate. And these effects will, of course, have to do with human health and safety, but they will also have to do with the economy and economics and financial effects. And when we think of those potential effects, then we have to remember that perhaps, if there might be some markets that won't be able to survive this particular crisis. And we have to remember, too, that maybe physical media could be affected, or it will be affected by this particular situation. What is the extent of that effect? I'm not quite sure yet. We're going to have to wait and see. But it is possible that something like this particular crisis could affect physical media markets in a pretty significant and severe way. And so we have to keep that in mind. And so with that being said, it really depends on the market. And I always am realistic in the Blu-ray marketplace or physical media marketplace in general, in saying that, while I support it, of course, I can totally understand also when it would be, when we might see the end of that kind of market. I hope it stays around for as long as possible, of course, but I also have to try to be realistic. And even if that day were to come, then I don't necessarily see it as being, there will always be ways to adapt. And even if one doesn't want to adapt, there will always be the discs that we have. And so, as I tried to mention in a previous video, it's always good to have cinema that we can watch over and over again. It's important to watch new cinema, of course, but it's also important to rewatch the classics. And so, even if the Blu-ray marketplace were to collapse, and again, I hope it lasts as long as possible, but even if it were to collapse, then we would still have what we have, and we would still be able to watch what it is we have. And I think that is a very important thing. It might not be perfect, but it will be something that we can always rely upon. And even now we can remember that, let's say, formats that are not prevalent now, like Laserdisc, VHS, are still very active in certain aspects of the fan base and communities. And so I think there will still be a lot of room for physical media for a long time, even if the physical media marketplace isn't fully active in the future. There will still be those communities that will still keep it alive for a long, long time. And that's true also for things like vinyl and music and that sort of thing. So I don't necessarily have any direct worries. Although, of course, I would like to see the market as healthy and be as prosperous as possible, of course. With that, with the caveat or the footnote that I have inherently absolutely nothing philosophically against streaming services or downloadable content. I have absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I hope that makes sense. But anyway, I'm sorry for the long-winded response. But John, thank you so much for your question. Next is Twisted Razor, our dear friend Twisted Razor, who says, "Hello Daisuke, I was wondering what your thoughts on movie theaters potentially phasing out, and do you think that this will ever happen? Thanks." Again, this is a question that I think is very similar to the past questions that I received. And it is possible. It is very possible. Movie theaters could be phased out. Again, it depends on the marketplace and the like. I must say, too, that I would be hypocritical if I didn't mention that in my own film journey, based on my own schedule and my own limitations and my own current situation, my work and my family, etc., that I am not able to go to the movie theaters as often as I did when I was, say, in my 20s. And that's, again, due to my own limitations of time and availability and that sort of thing. So I am probably, I am very, very guilty of not being able to support the local theaters as much as I would like to when I was younger. And so because I am also very reliant on home media, but I don't go to the movie theaters as often as I would like to. And so I should mention that, lest I seem to be hypocritical, and I hope I don't seem that way, but if I do, I apologize. But I do acknowledge my own, let's say, complicit or complicity, what's the phrase? My own, I do acknowledge my own lack of contribution in that respect, in terms of financial support. And so, I could say that, I wish movie theaters will survive, and I certainly hope they do, but I should mention that, lest I seem hypocritical. Now, with that out of the way, what is the effect on movie theaters? Well, I think we're feeling, again, with this current world crisis, there are certain risks that are involved with many aspects of the economy, including the movie theater experience. It's been like this before, but we have to see what will happen with the movie theater industry once this crisis is behind us. But I understand also that the movie theater industry is also divided into many levels. The sort of the big movie chains and also the independent theaters, etc. And so. And also this is combined with streaming and how people prefer to consume content, prices, money, finances, etc. And so I understand all of this. And so, or I think I do, at least on a very general level perhaps. So it really depends. It really depends. And do I think it will happen? Again, I'm not sure. It could happen. I can't deny the possibility that it could ever happen. Do I want it to happen? Of course not. But it really, again, depends on the nature of the market and the nature of the economy going forward. And we're just going to have to wait and see, unfortunately. There's something, however, that says to me that there will always be the movie theater experience. There are enough people in the industry who value the movie theater experience. And I think those voices will gather enough support over time to keep the movie theater experiences alive, even if it's in a certain form. Now, we'll have to keep an eye out on this, especially as we see the next days and weeks and months proceed going forward. But yeah, again, that's just my general take. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm not an economist, but I hope that makes sense. Anyway, thank you very much for your great question. Next is Andre. Our dear friend Andre Salgueiro. And Andre, thank you very much for your questions and your kindness and friendship as always. And so you have two questions. What are your favorite Japanese films of all time? And two, what are the Japanese films you would love to see in the Criterion Collection? Thanks and stay safe and well. Thank you very much. So what are your favorite Japanese films of all time? That is a very, very difficult question, and I don't think I'll be able to answer it in full right now because there's so many. It's so vast. It's like saying, what are your favorite movies of all time? And it's very hard to answer that question, but I could give you some examples if that's okay. Let's see. I think something like, maybe something like Funeral Parade of Roses comes to mind. Maybe something like When a Woman Ascends the Stairs comes to mind. Maybe something like maybe something like Late Spring comes to mind. Maybe something like, Ugetsu Monogatari, Ugetsu comes to mind. Also a film like Kurosawa's Ran comes to mind. And if I could mention others, I think a film, I haven't spoken too much about it, but I think a film like Miike's Dead or Alive comes to mind. And let's see, I've had great admiration for the film Akira of late, and I've spoken about it many times, but that comes to mind as well. And I think let's see, also maybe Oshima's The Ceremony comes to mind, and gosh, so many. But those are, I guess I could go on and on, but those are just some examples. But my tastes are quite limited. So, let's see, number two, what are the Japanese films you would love to see in the Criterion Collection? ATG films. I'd love to see more ATG films, Art Theater Guild films. I think we need more Art Theater Guild films outside of Japan. I have all but a couple on Japanese DVD and Blu-ray. All but a couple are, I think, in print. There are one or two that are out of print. I even have those that don't have DVD or Blu-rays, but they're only on Japanese VHS. I even have those, but there are some that you can't even get. But I have all but a couple, and I'd love to see ATG films in the Criterion Collection. The more the merrier. It is one of the most fascinating aspects of Japanese cinema. It's certainly not a perfect expression. There are some imperfections even within ATG, and I acknowledge those. But even with those imperfections in mind, I still think it is such a vital and an interesting aspect or sub-aspect of Japanese cinema and the growth and development of it, especially during the 60s and 70s, and even on through the 80s. And we have so many filmmakers that I think are very prevalent in that aspect of Japanese cinema that we all, I think, can recognize. like Oshima and to some extent Imamura and others. But there are other great filmmakers that would come to the fore, and I think would get a lot of recognition if more ATG films were introduced outside of Japan. I know that Arrow has done some great inroads with this in terms of their releases of the Yoshida films, for example, or the Akio Jisoji films, and also by extension Suzuki films. The Taisho trilogy set, I think, for example. I mean, those are considered to be ATG films in a certain way. But we could see also some other great films emerge. Some other great filmmakers also emerge. I would also add one of the great filmmakers that I think needs more attention outside of Japan, Hani, Susumu Hani, and others. I'd love to see more. But anyway, ATG films would be something that I'd love to see in the Criterion Collection, or any other label for that matter, Arrow or otherwise. But thank you very much, my friend. I hope my answer was satisfactory. If not, I sincerely apologize. If you want to talk more about Japanese cinema, my friend, just send me a private message and we can talk from there. Thank you very much. And let's see, Culture Fan, are there any films not on DVD or Blu-ray that you'd like to see finally get made? Yes, so I mentioned now ATG films. There are a number of ATG films that aren't on a DVD or Blu-ray in Japan or outside, and so I'd like to see some of those get a DVD or Blu-ray release, at least here in Japan, and if not, not just Japan, of course, to as many places in the world, but certainly, yeah, there are some of those that I'd like to see. Anyway, yeah, thank you very much. That's a really great question. And let's see, Blu-ray Benn. And Blu-ray Benn is, hey buddy, glad you're doing a Q&A as I am new to your channel, so always like getting to know people more. Here are my questions. Number 1, how is it that you speak such perfect English? Did you live in an English-speaking country or did you learn another way? By the way, I am an English teacher. Okay, so number 2, what 3 Japanese films that you love would you recommend me watching? 3, where have you traveled to outside of Japan, and which was your favorite place and why? Okay, so I'll answer the second question first. What 3 Japanese films that you love would you recommend me watching? There are so many Japanese films, but if I could recommend 3, I would recommend, if you haven't seen them already, When a Woman Ascends the Stairs, directed by Mikio Naruse, or any Naruse film for that matter. Then I would recommend, Funeral Parade of Roses, Matsumoto's film Funeral Parade of Roses. I think that has been given good Blu-ray treatment outside of Japan. So Funeral Parade of Roses, or DVD or Blu-ray treatment. And the third, I think, would be, if you haven't seen Ugetsu, I would recommend watching Ugetsu, Mizoguchi's film Ugetsu. That is a very, very fundamentally beautiful film, so overwhelmingly beautiful, and I tremble every time I think of that. So anyway, Ugetsu, or it's called Ugetsu Monogatari, but Ugetsu. The Criterion Collection, incidentally, has a really great supplement, extra film, which is part of its release, so I would recommend the Criterion supplement if you can. Okay, and then let's see, the first question I'll answer, which is, how is it that you speak such perfect English? Well, thank you very much for the kind compliment about my English level, but I don't think my English is at all perfect, but I do my best. And the reason why I speak English with an American accent is because I grew up in the United States. I was born in Japan, but I moved to the United States when I was about 2 years old. And also, in addition, there was a period when I was about 6 or 7 or so, I think, maybe a little bit older, I forget exactly, but in the late 80s, my family moved to the United Kingdom, and we lived in Surrey. We lived in Guildford, Surrey for a little bit, and then we moved to Woking, Surrey, and I actually went to school in Cobham, Surrey, and I had a number of friends who lived in Weybridge and Reading, Ripley, Send, and I remember Guildford and living there, and there was a great park there. I don't know if it's still there. There was Stoke Park. I don't know anyone who knows this area. Stoke Park was a really lovely place, and it was great. At the time, the shops on the high street would close at about 5 o'clock, I think, and there was the W.H. Smiths there, and the Agatha Christie, the Fontana paperbacks of Agatha Christie novels were about the price was £2.50. So that was an interesting time. I loved W.H. Smith. That was great. And those sorts of things. And so that was where I spent my childhood, more or less. And so, and along the way, I would learn Japanese through Japanese classes or Japanese school or that sort of thing. But my education was in English. And so that is where my English, my American accented English comes in. And then I also learned English through cinema as well. I gained a great appreciation of cinema and what it had to teach me. I've mentioned these before, but I'll mention them again. I learned a lot of great words and vocabulary through watching cinema and TV when I was growing up. And so I really, there was some, what is it? What is it? When Morse says to Lewis in one of the episodes, I forget exactly which, Lewis says death was instant, and I think Morse says, coffee is instant, death is instantaneous. So I really like that. I hope I got that right. If I got that wrong, please correct me. But that was an example of why I really clung on to cinema and TV back in the day. It really taught me a lot, I think. And I had a great admiration of Agatha Christie at the time, and there are many things I didn't understand, but it exposed me to a lot of poetry and also to literature and Shakespeare. And also, when I became a little bit older, I was able to study these on my own. I began to take classes and things like that in university. So that was sort of my background in English. And then now with my current job, I have to rely on a certain way to express myself in English in terms of writing and speaking. And so I have to be very, very careful in how I express myself, and I have to try to take care with the words that I choose. The third question is, where have you traveled to outside of Japan, and which was your favorite place and why? So I've traveled. I don't do a lot of traveling now. I do some, but not as much as I did when I was a kid, because my parents loved to travel. And so we would take family trips to, for example, places in Europe, France. We went to Spain. We went to. I've never been to Italy. I've always wanted to go to Italy one of these days. And but I went also to Germany. We lived in the United Kingdom for some time, and then let's see. As far as the United States is concerned, we went to many places in the U.S., Canada as well. I remember also had a very great trip. I took a trip by myself when I was in college to some places in the South, Nashville, and tried to make a trip to Sun Studios, which was a really fun time. I'm a great admirer of rockabilly and rock and roll, so that was such a wonderful thing to be able to go to Sun Studios and the like. So I was trying to. It wasn't quite like what we see in, my adventure to Sun Studios wasn't as adventurous, shall we say, as, let's say, a Jim Jarmusch film, but it was still something. It was like my own little mini Jim Jarmusch film that I was living out, I suppose. So it was really a lot of fun, but so that was a great time. And I suppose also, where else have I been? There are many other places that I'd love to visit, but now that I live in Tokyo, my family would like to go visit New York again. we'd like to go visit there. So when all this world crisis stuff has calmed down and is behind us, I'd like to go and visit New York again. I have a great fondness for the city, and I'd like to see the sights and to meet the people and to eat the food and to enjoy life there. So one of these days I'd like to go visit New York again. So to all of my dear friends who are in New York, please, my warmest regards. One day I will visit again. It's such a great place. But and there are other places that I'd like to visit too. As I say, I haven't visited Italy, and one of these days I must go visit Italy. Again, my warmest regards to our dear friends in Italy. And once this whole thing is behind us, then hopefully I can try to plan a trip there one of these days. I'd love to go there. As well as many, many other places in the world that I haven't visited that I'd love to go one of these days. Again, so much to do, so little time. So much to do, so little money. That's the therein lies the dilemma. Yes, but yes. So I hope that answers your question, my friend. But thank you very much for this great question, or great set of questions. Okay, my friend, so let me end it there, and I will still continue on with these. But anyway, my dear friends, thank you very much for your questions and always expressing an interest in what it is this channel is about and who I am. I'm very, very flattered as always. And I hope that my answers were satisfactory. If not, I sincerely apologize. It's not my intent to offend or do anything like that. So if I say I don't like this film or I don't like that thing or something, please don't take offense. It's just my own personal take. But otherwise, my friends, please continue to be well, stay safe, stay strong, stay happy, stay healthy, and keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. I will still be here, and if you have any more questions, please feel free to leave them behind. I will do my best to address them. I can't address all of them, but I will do my best to address as many as possible. So thank you once again, and cheers.